Luke chapter 4, verses 14 and 15. Jesus returned to Galilee in the power of the Spirit, and news about him spread through the whole countryside. He was teaching in their synagogues, and everyone praised him.
Looks great. You want me to walk up again? Are we going for the bumper or just going? Alrighty. All right, let's go for it. All right, I'm just going to pray before I begin. Dear Lord, I just ask that you'll open up our hearts and our minds this morning, that you'll be able to talk through me as a vessel, and that people will be able to be challenged, uplifted, and they'll be able to understand and hear something new about you, Lord. Amen. So firstly, I'm going to start off with a bit of, an apology, a confession, and a bit of an explanation, which might sound a little bit of a strange way to start a message, but I found this sermon really difficult to produce. And that's not from there being a lack of content. I know that we had a very short Bible reading, but it's not from there being a lack of content, but almost there being too much. If we're going on the journey to the cross, or footsteps of Jesus, or whatever we're calling it, then there's almost too much of a journey in Galilee to really give proper attention to everything in a simple sermon. Like most sermons, you can just take one parable and do a 20-minute sermon just on that. And there's a lot of parables and miracles that Jesus did in Galilee. So we'd be here for hours all afternoon if you just got me to talk about all of that. So Glen's helped by taking the Sea of Galilee, which is why I'm not doing the Sea of Galilee. So that's taken some of it off. But I've sort of split this into two halves, this message. I've got a more factual start to it, where it's going to be a little bit maybe drier in content, where it's going to be Jesus's walk. We're going to go through a brief overview of that, and then we're going to go into what Galilee was and who the Galileans were and what were they like and what was life for them like. And then in the second part, I'm going to get you guys to imagine yourselves as a Galilean. I'm going to then preach or read a couple of the parables that Jesus would have spoken to the Galileans, and then try and get you to imagine that you are there in that scenario. Then I'll explain more on that later, and I'm just going to dive into the first part. The Galilee was a pretty important region in the Bible. It's this little bit here, and then there's the sea there. And it's mentioned 64 times just in the New Testament, and a further 9 in the Old Testament, which, if you do your maths, is 73 times total in the Bible. But just from the density of how much it's mentioned in the New Testament, you can sort of see how important it was to Jesus' ministry and Jesus' life in general. So we're just going to do a quick rundown of what Jesus would have got up to in Galilee. First of all, he grew up. He was born in Bethlehem, went to Egypt for a bit, but then was in Galilee for most of the rest of his growing up. He'd have done all the normal Galilean childhood things. He'd have learnt carpentry from his dad. He'd have been taught about Old Testament law, the Torah. He'd have gone to whatever Galilean equivalent of school was back in the day, maybe even had homework. He'd have possibly even gone on family holidays, maybe to the Sea of Galilee, because he was only in Nazareth. He might have gone out to the Mediterranean Sea. Maybe he got in a little lilo thing and enjoyed splashing around. I think part of the beauty to me of Jesus is how relatable he is, in that God became fully man and did all the sort of normal human things that we'd expect someone to do. Secondly, he called his disciples. Some were tax collectors, some were fishermen, some looked familiar. And what's important about a lot of the disciples and then the apostles is they all sort of came from Galilee. They were either Galileans by birth or by residence. They were all from that area. I'm going to skip back to that one. Jesus performed 19 of his 32 parables and 25 of his 33 miracles. And now we're going to be going through a couple of those in detail in a minute. This is a picture that came up when I typed in Sermon of the Mount. It's even got an old road that Jesus might have used and the old Land Rover Defender donkey driving up it. You might have found one of those helpful going through the desert at times. But you can see from just the pure numbers that Jesus spent a lot of his time there. Of his roughly 3.5-year ministry, Jesus spent 2.5 to 3 years just in Galilee alone. So that's a big percentage of his time spent in one region. I've got a shortened sort of highlights list of what he did there in his Galilean ministry. He taught the synagogues. He did the Sermon on the Mount. He heals lepers, blind people, slaves, Jairus' daughter. He had parables of the sower of the weeds, mustard seed, pearl, landowner, net, hidden treasure, just to name a few. The Great Commission, the final sort of instruction from Jesus to his disciples. Almost probably the most important instruction he gave his disciples. Go out and make disciples of all nations. We're not stood here today without, well, that's apparently Mount Arbel, where this all happened. So without all of that happening, we don't have our church here today. We don't be able to tell, we haven't then been told about Jesus. We can't tell other people give the good news about Jesus. So go and make all disciples. Okay, so that's a very brief overview of what Jesus did and Jesus' ministry in Galilee. So now we're going to move into the actual land of Galilee. What did it look like? What were the people like? So back in Jesus' time, Galilee was split into two sections, nicely named Upper Galilee and Lower Galilee. Upper Galilee was a more mountainous region, had a little bit of more rocky terrain, and then had a peak of about 1,200 meters. By contrast, Lower Galilee was sort of more your rolling hills, lower peaks of about 1,000 feet, so about 200 odd meters or so in height. It was the more fertile land, the more agricultural land that people would have used for growing crops. That being said, all of Galilee was said to be a very fertile land. You'd get trees growing in the mountains, and it's said that all the soil could hold any type of plant and tree and fruit, whether it thrives in a cold climate or a hot climate. Galilee could do it all. It's also important to think what we think of when we see Galilee is the Sea of. Now, Pastor Glen is going to be speaking on that tonight, so I'm not going to go into it in too much detail, but it would have been a very important place for fishing and trading, and the sort of people based their lives around the sea at times. So a fertile land, good routes for trading. A lot of Galilee's wealth was made off of the land and off of what the earth could provide. And because of that, it was a relatively well-off and potentially influential area. There were some people of influence in there, and it was in a relatively good standing in the surrounding nations, mostly because of how fertile the land was. People would come in there to get their crops if they couldn't grow it themselves. And now this brings us more onto the people of Galilee, which has been a mildly confusing topic, because it's part of the kingdom of Israel, so you'd assume that everyone there is predominantly Jews. But also in Isaiah 9 and Matthew 4, it's referred to as Galilee of the nations, or Galilee of the Gentiles. So which is it? Well, it's both, nicely. Galilee was a big sort of mixing pot of cultures, and it had been since Joshua's conquering into the promised land, and they all sort of all the tribes that didn't get wiped out as they should have been ended up in the Galilee region. So from the beginning of the country of Israel, it's sort of been a big mixing pot of cultures. And then even after the Assyrian invasion, it was left largely deserted because the northern tribes of Israel, it was part of the northern part of Israel. It got decimated by the Assyrians and then moved on up, taken out of the land, scattered around. And then it wasn't really until the Roman occupation of Judea as a whole that we come back into Galilee being massively populated again. And there was a big influx of people coming into Galilee around about a century, just over a century before Jesus was born. And by the time that Jesus was born, it's estimated that there was around 2 to 3 million people just in this little region here, which I've done some research, and it's less than half the size of metropolitan Sydney. That's a lot of people crammed into quite a small area. So that's possibly why Jesus was able to get such large crowds into when he was speaking. And another thing I thought about when I've been thinking about the people of Galilee and why it's such a good mixing pot and why it's good that the disciples came from, is that because it was a mixing pot and there were so many cultures and different belief systems in there, is that there would have been more sort of acceptance and able to blend into other societies and other cultures as they step out to spread the news to all nations. So we see like Paul later on, and I know Paul's not from Galilee, so give me a little bit of creative freedom there. But Paul is saying, I became all things to all nations so that I can win people for Jesus. So that example of the sort of Galilean mixing pot from the disciples is there as they go out. Okay. So hopefully now I've given you a bit of an idea into what it was like to be a Galilean, working the land, working on the Sea of Galilee during Jesus' time. I want to help us look at what the relevance and how Jesus was speaking to them in a relatable way during that time. So there's a couple of parables that came to my mind. There was the parable of the sower initially, and the parable of the weeds. And this quite literally would have related to a lot of people. If it's a major agricultural land, a lot of people would have been able to go, oh yeah, I know what this guy's talking about. I remember throwing my weeds and them hitting a path and hitting the land and birds taking off with them. People would have been able to relate and go, I know what you're talking about. And you are going to have to give me a little bit of creative freedom with this, because I know in the same passages that I'm going to be reading from, it does say that these people will be ever hearing and never understanding. So I know that people, if we're in the church today, we do have an understanding of these parables because we have Jesus' explanations written down. But what I'm going to get you to do while I'm reading is I'm going to get you to close your eyes and imagine you're there on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. Jesus is out there on the boat, and then whatever image you have of a boat, whether it's a small little rubber dinghy, whether it's a big merchant sailing ship, whatever boat it is you're imagining, and whatever vision you have of Jesus as a man, I want you to imagine that. I want you to try and hear Jesus speaking to you. Smell the smells, hear the sounds that are going on around you. Really try and immerse yourself in this. Now, I'm not going to do Jesus full justice as a public speaker. I'm not quite as good as him. But when I'm speaking to you, just get into a headspace. I'm going to ask you to do that now. Get into the headspace of just trying to imagine what it would have been like to be in that situation. I'm going to have the passages up here as well for those of you that don't want to close your eyes. But otherwise, close your eyes and immerse yourself into that. I'll get you to do that now, and then I will start reading. A farmer went out to sow his seed. As he was scattering the seed, some fell along the path, and the birds came up and ate it. Some fell on rocky places, where it did not have much soil. It sprang up quickly because the soil was shallow. But when the sun came up, the plants were scorched, and they withered because they had no root. Other seed fell among the thorns, which grew up and choked the plants. Still, other seed fell on good soil, where it produced a crop 100, 60, or 30 times what was sown. Whoever has ears to hear, let them hear. And the kingdom is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while everyone was sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. When the wheat sprouted and formed heads, then the weeds also appeared. The owner's servants came to him and said, "Sir, don't you sow good seed in your field? Where then did the weeds come from?" "An enemy did this," he replied. The servants asked him, "Do you want us to go and pull them up?" "No," he answered, "because while you are pulling the weeds, you may uproot the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. At that time, I will tell the harvesters, 'First collect the weeds and tie them in bundles to be burned. Then gather the wheat and bring it into my barn.'" Okay, thanks for taking part in that, guys. My prayer is that you'll have been able to experience the passage in a slightly different way there. And I hope that you're able to also see how Jesus is relatable. He could speak into your experiences. He did that now, and he can do that today. God is not a far off, distant, aloof, "I'm better than you" God. He is a God that has reached out to us. He has been in the mud with us. He can relate through the joys and the struggles and the good times and the bad. And the question I just want to leave you on to finish on is, can you relate to Jesus? Can you relate to him on the cross? Can you accept the fact that he has died on the cross for you? And if you have, that's amazing. But if you haven't, what's holding you back? Jesus is there with you through every single step.